Welcome to the Security Cloud podcast with the host, Lars Kamp.
So Kabir and I were just talking and prepping for this podcast here, talking about what a unified API for security data is. And Kabir is the CEO here at Leen Data. And Kabir, let's just dive right in. What is a unified API for security data? Why do I need one? What problem does it solve? And why do I need one now? What has changed?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Lars, and appreciate you jumping right in. I think this is the most value we can provide to your listeners. So the concept of unified APIs has existed within other parts of the software industry for a while, right? So if you look at the SaaS space, for example, there are obviously 2 or 3 dominant CRMs like the HubSpots and the Salesforces of the world, but there are probably 100 others similar with ticketing systems, similar with HR and payroll systems. So you had unified APIs that cropped up in these segments to make it easier for other companies building products in the space to build and maintain integrations with all of these different tools, because it's a huge product and engineering time sink to build and maintain integrations, which honestly is not something that's proprietary within the software stack. The way company A builds an integration with Salesforce versus the way company B does it is not going to be terribly different. It's what you do with that data that matters. And we've seen a very similar paradigm play out in security, where at this point we have close to 4,000 vendors, many of which are multi-product. So we have 10,000 or so products in the market. And if you're either a founder like me that's starting a company at this point in security, or even if you're higher up on the maturity curve and you're looking at this landscape, right, it's a huge engineering effort to continually build and maintain these connectors. And it's a never-ending battle because the APIs keep changing. So it's not a one and done type of thing. Okay, I built this CrowdStrike connector, great. That's it forever. No, CrowdStrike is going to change the API. They're going to release new products, and that necessitates you having a team that's on top of that all the time. And now multiply that by 100 different vendors. That's a team of 5, 10 engineers who have to stay on top of this type of thing. So I think that's the shift in the market that we've seen recently, that there's too many tools. And the nature of security data in particular is such that it's very interconnected, right? You need to rely on signals from all sorts of different sources to get the full context of a specific alert or a vulnerability, or if it's a GRC use case. But I think that's what makes this such an important time in the industry to introduce a unified API.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that analogy resonates with me because I used to be in the analytics space, right? And so I think you're referring to vendors like maybe like a Fivetran or an Airbyte in those, right? And they're basically it's ELT, right? The whole Snowflake, the modern data stack, dbt, and all that stuff, right? Where I unify data from disparate SaaS tools to get a single view of the customer journey. And so you've done that essentially for security data, right? Like on the back end, you connect to all these. Like I'm an enterprise. I have 40 different tools, and at some point, I don't know where to look anymore, right? And what you've done is you've built the connectors in all these different systems, and you unify it into a single place.
Yep, that's exactly right. I will say we differentiate a little bit from typical ETL or ELT products like Fivetrans of the world, because yes, they normalize the data, they have the connectors, but they really just move data from point A to point B, so they can dump the data for you in your Snowflake, in your AWS, whatever. A unified API goes a step beyond that. So of course, we are also an ETL pipeline at the core of things, but we then deliver that data over an API. So it's actually very accessible in code for developers to use within their application and then create logic around that, rather than now having to write an abstraction layer around their database to pull that data out and use it within their application. So that's just one extension and one clarification that I'd like to make.
Right. And I saw on your website you have, I think you have SDKs for, I think like 10 or 12 different languages, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. The difference is, in the data integration world, we're talking about SQL and cloud warehouses, and here we're talking actually about an API. So you make the secure data programmatically accessible in whatever application. Yeah. How did you attack this? What tools did you integrate with first, right? how did you decide on the data model? Because you still, I mean, unifying data sounds great, but there needs to be some sort of normalization that I can actually use it and you take out complexity for me. So can you talk a little bit about like, how did you pick the tools? How many tools integrations do you support today? And how do you normalize data across these different tools?
Yeah, so it's a very poignant question, and we had to be very pragmatic when approaching this because, like I said, there's so many thousands of tools we could have started anywhere. So the way we think about it is in terms of lowest common denominators, not only in terms of the specific tools that we started with, but also how we normalize data. And I think that concept is very relevant to both. So to start with it on the tool side, right? We, of course, like a lot of startups, we're only about a year into our journey at this point. You rely on your initial set of customers to be like design partners, and it's a very collaborative relationship. So it was working with them very closely to understand what tools their customers were asking for, because ultimately we're a B to B to B play, right? We're selling to other security vendors who then have customers on their end that are requesting specific integrations. So it was just about collating that data across a few customers on our site to understand, okay, which are the categories that are going to drive the most value for you. Those, in our case, ended up being EDR, as you would expect, so the
Yeah.
CrowdStrikes, the Sentinel-1s of the world, as well as vulnerability management integrations with Tenable, Qualys, Rapid7, and so on. We also saw some demand for AppSec, by the way. So Sneak and SendGrab came up quite a lot. So those are the three categories that we started with. And that's really how we approach this equation of how to tackle the industry and break it up into bite-sized chunks, so to speak, is we look at it on a category by category basis. So when we attack a category, we of course look for the top 3 to 5 vendors in that category that we should integrate with. But when it comes to the data normalization, we also do a lot of research on our side in terms of looking at various API documentation from these different products and finding the lowest common denominator. What is the core security data that these APIs are producing that will add value to our customers today, but also could be valuable to the next 100 customers that we close on our site? And how can we normalize that? So we came up initially with our own schema for that in collaboration, again, with our customers. But more and more, we're now starting to normalize to the OCSF standard, which, if your listeners are not familiar with, is the open cybersecurity schema framework, which is really pioneered by the folks at Cisco and Splunk, and is, I would say, probably the standard that's gained the most traction within the industry so far. There are a couple of others as well. We're actually contributors to OCSF. So what I'd say is when we started a year ago, OCSF was still not mature enough to handle some of the use cases that we had thought of and were relevant to our customers. But they've made a lot of improvements over the last year, and of course, we're contributing to make sure that our perspective is also considered. And now more and more, we're trying to normalize to OCSF as much as possible.
Can you repeat one more time the 3 categories of tools that you integrated with and that you started with, just for the benefit of the listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's endpoint detection and response. In that category, we started with the big 3 players in the space: CrowdStrike, Sentinel-1, Microsoft Defender for endpoint. Then on the vulnerability management side, we did Qualys, Rapid7, Tenable, who are the 3 big vendors there, but we now also support CrowdStrike, Microsoft, and Sentinel-1's vulnerability management solutions. And then we call it AppSec, but really it's SAST and SCA issues within application security. And there we started with Sneak and SemGrep. And you were asking earlier about the number of integrations we have at this point. And again, we are still a young company, just over a year into our journey. So we have about 15 connectors, 15 connectors that we support across different categories. We also recently launched our CSPM category. So the Wizzes, the Laceworks, the Microsoft Defender for clouds of the world. And we have several other categories that we plan to launch through the end of the year as well.
And don't get me wrong, I think that's plenty, 15, right? Because as you said, it's really easy to build. I mean, relatively easy, right? It's really easy to build these integration. It's much harder to maintain them, right? That's the hard part. That's the hard part, and you're doing that. And maybe we get a chance a little bit later to talk about how exactly you do that. Like, what do you do to test the APIs to make sure the response is always right? And I thought it was great that you mentioned these three categories: EDR, vulnerability management, and AppSec, or maybe that's evolving into CNAPP. Cloud Native Application Protection Platform. Always call out the acronyms, and I think what I didn't appreciate immediately, or I only appreciated after I sifted through your website, which by the way looks great, is that you are a B2B company, right? Like at first I thought, oh, okay, this makes total sense. I'm an enterprise. I got 40 tools. My people don't know where to look at what screen, so I unify everything. But really, you're the data integration layer for a lot of these other GRC or governance and tools, and the logos are on your website. I mean, Drata being the most prominent one, phenomenal company. So, was that the plan from the beginning, or did you sort of stumble upon that?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. Of course, with any startup, you need some element of luck, right? You have grand plans, but they almost never pan out the way you expect. So the way we approached it, I think, is going through a classical validation journey that I'm sure lot of other founders go through as well. So we talked to about 100 folks within the industry before we truly had the conviction to build this company, to raise money against this idea. So we talked to CISOs, we talked to heads of security engineering. So that's on the security team side of the equation. But then we also talked to a lot of product managers and founders and CTOs of security companies themselves, the ones actually building products for the space. And we realized that it's a fairly universal problem. But to be honest, again, as a startup, you're trying to find the path of least resistance. And companies like Drata, even though they're quite large, amazing company, as you said, I think they have a $2 billion plus valuation at this point, are much easier to sell into for a company at our stage. Because they're, a few hundred people as opposed to going straight to a Fortune 500 or even a Fortune 2000 type of security team and trying to convince them to work with this startup who's only been around for a year. So that's part of why we tackle this space. But of course, more pragmatically as well, the need from this segment was really clear, right? Where we talked to these CTOs and they said, I don't want to own this. There's no reason for me to have a team of 5 developers that all they do is maintain integrations and build new ones as my customers ask for them. If there was a solution to this problem, I would happily pay for it. And we heard that time and time and time again. And that's why we started with this segment.
Is the word commoditize the right word if you're commoditizing the data integration layer? But at that point, it's everyone is going to standardize eventually on the dominant platform, which might be you, right? Which might be Leen. And it's interesting that the CTOs of these companies didn't consider this like a proprietary differentiation. They just wanted to have the data, and they differentiate probably with the user experience on the front end. Do you already see like a 2080 type of rule where I just know this again from the analytics world, where yes, a Fivetran or whoever it is, a DLT hub, they have 80 connectors, but really people hear about Salesforce, Google Analytics, Facebook ads, and then maybe 4 or 5 others. Do you already see like popularity of tools sort of that make up that 80% of the market? Do you see that data?
Yeah, we do. I think in some categories it's a little bit more obvious than in others. EDR, for example, I think you have pretty good coverage across the market. Probably, I don't know the exact stats, but probably 80% of the market is dominated by the 3 players we talked about before. Whereas other segments probably have a little bit more fragmentation. Right? Email security, for example, is one of the categories we plan to release before the end of the year. Of course, you have the legacy players like the Cisco Secure Emails and the Proofpoints and the Mimecast, but then you have a host of relatively new companies in the space like the Abnormals and the Sublimes of the world. And I think there is a much longer tail in that category, for example. So, yeah, I think it just depends from category to category. Our goal over time, of course, is to integrate with everything. But when we start, we typically choose the most dominant players in a particular category.
So, talking about the unified API for security data, another term that comes up a lot is security data fabric. Can you elaborate about how the two categories relate to each other and what the differences are?
Yeah, I'm very glad you brought this up because we see ourselves evolving into a security data fabric company. And I know this is, there's so many acronyms in this industry. I actually don't come from a security background. And when I first started learning about the industry, it was like, wow, there are way too many acronyms in this
Yeah.
space. I think, yeah, let's talk about defining this one in particular because it is relatively new. It's not like this category has existed for a while. And I've already seen many different interpretations of this. To us, the way we think about a security data fabric is a platform on top of which applications can be built. You can think about it as a data layer, where of course you have the basic connectors, but it's also a normalization layer. It's a correlation layer. What that means, for example, is if there is a specific device within an enterprise environment, can we track that device across different tools within that stack or an identity or a code repo or whatever that may be, right? So that's a correlation layer where you can track specific entities across different tools and understand the relationships between the different entities. And this is very useful data, these correlations, this graph sort of database that you're standing up is very useful to build applications on top of. We're agnostic to what those applications are going to be, right? They could be external facing applications like the Dradas of the world, where they're obviously creating this very sophisticated GRC product for the SMB and mid-market segment. But they could also be internal facing applications where more engineering focused, more data driven security teams want to build internal tooling to orchestrate the several tools that they already have in their stack, which, by the way, today I think the number stands at 50 to 75 security tools within a large enterprise's stack, right? It's some
Yeah.
security engineer's job to manage all those tools, to understand the data from them, to do reporting, to write some automations across tools. And we think we see that very much as a platform engineering play, but for security, right? There are a lot of platform engineering resources and tools that exist for traditional software engineering teams. That shift has not yet happened in security. And that's really our interpretation of a security data fabric and what it can enable for these security teams. We see it as an internal app builder or this platform for security engineering teams to utilize.
Can you observe a shift in skills in the market? Meaning, if we go 15 years back, then I mean, I'm going to stick my neck out and say it was looking at dashboards and creating tickets, right? I'm oversimplifying, right? But what I see now is that I see more and more security engineers and security teams that have actual technology chops, right? They can write code, security engineering, right? And you have an API, right? So that means someone needs to write code. Are you observing a shift in security teams to a more, let's say, I don't know, are they writing more code? Is it a shift from looking at dashboards to building your own stuff? Like, talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so you hit the nail on the head. This is a big hypothesis that and a bet that we as a company are making, and is that this trend, which we are observing, and I'll talk a little bit about that, is only going to accelerate. And the way we validated this trend, of course, at this point, because we've been around for a year, we've talked to hundreds of different practitioners, and it's become obvious that this is a trend that is accelerating because we ask these people about their backgrounds, right? And a lot of them are either former software engineers or know enough about coding to be able to write mini applications or widgets, whatever you want to call it, to further advance their security programs. Plus, we talk to CISOs and we ask them, hey, off the open headcount you have, how many of these folks that you're looking for have an engineering background requirement? And the percentage is much higher than you would expect. And we've actually written a scraper just to keep an eye on this trend. We scrape some of the jobs on LinkedIn and we actually see what the requirements are. There's certain keywords about building internal applications or having a background in writing certain proficiency in Python or whatever it may be, right? And that trend is clearly accelerating. Plus, the other sort of fundamental trend that we think underpins this whole hypothesis is that at the end of the day, if you really simplify security, I think it's just a big data problem, right?
Yeah.
What security engineers and analysts are doing is looking at mountains of data and trying to find the true positives from all of the noise. And we just don't think that you can scale big data problems without applying engineering principles to these problems. And you've seen that time and time again in the traditional analytics and software engineering space. And we think it's due to happen in security as well.
Yeah. And so you let the existing vendors be the experts in data collection through whatever method, right? An agent, agentless, you name it, right? And then you become the specialist in integrating that data and unifying that data and normalizing that data and then making it programmatically accessible. So it's almost like the best of all worlds, right? Like me as a company, I can use any tool I want, but if I want it all in a single dashboard or in my data fabric, then I can work with Lean and I get it all, right? I get my cake and I get to eat it too.
That's right. Yeah, we're totally agnostic to the source of the data, the type of vendor, how they collect it. We can normalize it all the same. And so we sit in the middle, right? On one side, you have the vendors who are producing this data. On the other side, you have other vendors at the moment who are utilizing the data to automate workflows or add some intelligence to their customers, or you have security teams that are analyzing it. We're not the experts at that piece either, right?
Mm-hmm.
We make it really easy for them to understand the data and add their secret sauce, their business logic on top of it, which of course is very specific to each vendor, like the Dradas of the world, but equally to security teams who might define risk very differently, right? The way a financial institution defines risk, even if they're a small financial institution, is probably going to be very different than a typical SaaS startup of the same size. So that's what we enable for these teams to do agnostically.
Yeah. And so you have essentially you have these two customer segments. On one side are the security vendors like the Dradas that use your data to feed it into their own product because they don't consider it a core differentiating capability to capture that data. And on the other hand, you now have an emerging segment of enterprises that may be looking to build their own applications because they want to have a customized way of measuring risk for their organization, which may differ from vertical to vertical, like in financial services. Can you share a couple of use cases? I mean, you talked about Drata and GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. Any other fun use cases that you can share where maybe you had a reaction like, I would have never come up with that. Like, oh my God, this is so interesting.
Yeah, this is the great thing, and I've always appreciated this from the outside looking in about platform type of companies where the founders could not have imagined all of the different use cases that their thing will be used for, right? And that's happened with us already fairly early in this journey. So in Drata's case, I can just talk about that use case a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
They use Lean's connectors, so with these EDR tools, with these vulnerability management systems, to automate the process of evidence collection for, let's say, a SOC 2 or an ISO 27001 audit. So it's not just point in time data, they actually do continuous monitoring of those controls as well. For example, do you have the latest malware agent, anti-malware agent on all of the devices in your fleet, right? And it's not just collecting that one time, they continuously check for that from CrowdStrike or SentinelOne or whoever that provider is. It's a very powerful use case, and this data actually reflects in their trust center, which you might see on a lot of different websites of customers of Drata, where if you click on that, you can actually see the actual status of that particular control in real time. So it gives a lot of trust to their buyers, right, or their customers to know, okay, Drata is monitoring this for this particular company. I can buy this product with confidence and know that they've just not faked it for their SOC 2 audit for a couple of months. This is actually an ongoing thing. That's what we do in the GRC segment. There are a few other companies we work with there as well. Cyber insurance is actually an interesting use case that's cropped up very recently for us. We closed our first customer in that space. It's a company called Cowbell Cyber.
Yes.
They primarily sell cyber insurance policies to SMBs, lower mid-market type of companies. And if you think about the insurance use case, right, you're just managing risk as a company like Cowbell. And the way they do that today to understand the risk of their customers, either new customers or ones that are coming up for renewal, is they have some type of questionnaire where they ask about the security posture of the company, the policies they have instituted to make sure that their employees are following due process and all that kind of stuff, right? That's not really backed by any sort of evidence. It's you're just taking someone's word for it, and then maybe you're doing some type of market survey and saying, okay, this company in this region, we can sort of allocate this type of risk to them. What we are enabling them to do is to actually back up those answers in those questionnaires with real data. So a
Hmm.
company going to Cowbell and saying, okay, I want to purchase this policy, Cowbell can now say, okay, show me your data. Let me check your CrowdStrike. Let me check your Tenable. Let me check your Wiz instance and see that the things you're telling me in this questionnaire are actually valid. So it's
Hmm.
kind of similar to that GRC use case, but of course, in this case, it's driving an underwriting decision. So they can then offer the most accurate premium to this company. That was a use case that we would have never thought of, but we sort of accidentally stumbled into it. And now we're trying to work with other companies in the cyber insurance space as well.
So I happen to know that space a little bit. A friend of mine, and maybe you should talk to him, right? His name is Max Brunner. He co-founded a company called Anzen, which is, they do exactly that. So I think what you're going to find is that, yes, it gives you a more exact estimation of the risk because you have actual data, but you're going to be a massive accelerator for their deal cycle. That's actually the true value, because the agent now actually can outsource all this work of data collection, and it just like shrinks the deal cycle by a lot. It's a huge value creation for them. Yeah, a phenomenal use case. Well, you mentioned a few tidbits like APIs, real-time data integration. Can we shift gears and roll around in the tech stack a little bit to whatever extent you can disclose it? I don't mean to like uncover your secret sauce, right? But how you build these API integrations, literally like where do you store it? How do you collect the data? What's your database? How do you expose it from there? Like walk us through it to the extent that you can.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not the most technical person on the team. I'm not the
Mhm.
CTO. I'm the CEO of this company, but I'll try
Mhm.
my best to
Yeah.
tell you about our tech stack. So my co-founder, Neil, who's the CTO, built and solved this problem in some way previously. He used to be at a company called Blue Voyant, which is a fairly large MDR and threat intelligence provider, where he built a lot of these integrations from scratch. So a lot of what we're doing here is inspired by the work that he did there. But of course, there it was one to one, right? What everything he was building was for Blue Voyant. In our case, of course, we're building a service that's agnostic and can be used by a variety of different companies. So our tech stack is fairly simple. It's what you would expect from company like ours that's born in the cloud. We use AWS as our backend. The way it works is we run jobs. We use a tool called Temporal that
Yep.
some of your listeners may be familiar with that does workflows and orchestration around those workflows. So
Hmm.
we poll all of these APIs that we support on a specific cadence. So every few hours, but of course we have the ability to change that to every minute or even seconds if some of our customers require that. We fetch the data, we normalize it all within our sort of instance, and then we cache the data on our side. So within our AWS environment, and our customers pull the data from us over our API
Hmm.
at whatever cadence they want. So it's not so much a real time use case, although we can get pretty close to real time. Like I said, we could fetch the data and serve it all within a minute of it being produced. But for most of our customers, like the GRC use cases I've been talking about, getting the data every few hours is more than enough, right? Because
Yeah.
the number of vulnerabilities in an environment is typically not changing that drastically, even in a day, much less in a few hours. So that's at a super high level. That's sort of the tech stack and the way that it works today. Since this is security data, we know that there could be some concerns around us being a store of data and so on. So we've, of course, gone through our SOC 2 Type 2 compliance. We're secure by design in every way possible. We will, in the future, have a more flexible deployment model where we could deploy our cluster of services within our customer's cloud environment as well. And then the data store is their AWS or their GCP instance, for example, and that and it's come up in a few of our conversations, and that hopefully
Of
will
course.
alleviate some concerns around having another party store this data.
Of course, yeah. And I would assume for your own SOC 2 compliance, I hope you use Strata. You don't need to say, but yeah. Okay, yeah. And real time, everyone always gets excited about real time, but turns out like no one really needs it, right? Like, what are you going to do with it? Create a ticket and then whatever, give a 90-day SLA to solve it. So it's just, yeah.
That's right.
Batch data, that's where it's at. Okay, all right. So that's your stack running in AWS. Lofty goal. So 4,000 security vendors out there with 10,000 products. So you got a mountain of work ahead of you there. How do you run your team? Where's your team? Is it in San Francisco? That's where we met, right? At an SVB event. And
Right.
how do you run your team?
Yeah, so we're still a pretty small team at the moment. We're 8 people. Again, just a few months into our journey, or a year and a few months into our journey. There's 4 of us here in San Francisco, where I'm dialing in from today. We have 2 other folks in other parts of the US, and we have 2 in India. So there's 3 of us on the founding team, and 2 of us are from India originally. So we have roots in India, of course, and it's a very exciting place at the moment in terms of producing amazing talent. So over time, we plan to build a larger engineering function out of India, but then of course have a core team based here in the US as well.
Which is amazing. So, software engineering and especially security, from my experience in India, it's a cult, it's a religion. Like, people really take pride in that skill. In your view, what has to change in the market for an accelerated adoption of a unified API for security data? And maybe to elaborate on my own question a little bit, what I've seen sometimes is that the business side doesn't appreciate the need for security as much as they should, right? Or not just for security, for other engineering disciplines as well. FinOps being one example, dev, whatever, it's like always like, oh yeah, we need this, but really I want to sell more widgets, right? What are some inhibitors that you've seen in the market that sort of slow down adoption, when in reality you see a use case where hey, I can really help you, like how can we unblock this? Have you encountered any of these roadblocks?
Yeah, I think it definitely exists, right? And if you think about the dynamic, again, I'm relatively new to security, but to me, it's pretty obvious how this plays out at fairly large companies as well as small ones, where you have a security team that, of course, their whole job is to understand the risk posture of their environment and figure out what the vulnerabilities are. But unfortunately, it's not their job to fix those vulnerabilities. They're typically dependent on engineers, and having worked at a lot of other startups and working very closely with engineers, I can understand the frustration and why they see security as just this thing that they have to do, but they don't really enjoy doing. Like, none of these engineers particularly appreciate having to look at some CVE and figure out
Yeah,
what the root cause is and fix that, rather than building, I don't know, some AI enabled feature that they
of
can
course.
then sell to their customers. So I think that's the fundamental challenge. But that's also, we like that challenge because I think there's something there. There's part of it is not speaking the same language, right? And we're on the West Coast here. We talk to a lot of these really tech forward companies who are very data driven in the way that they approach every other part of their company, everything from finance to sales to, of course, product experiments that they run. Everything is a funnel, everything is really well measured, but that discipline is sort of lacking in security. And I think it all starts with having a common understanding of the risk and also the same type of visibility, right? So if maybe it sounds simple, but maybe if the security team and the engineering team had the same interpretation of risk and they had the same visibility around the different vulnerabilities in their environment and the root cause and the impact of those, then it could just make it a little bit easier for them to understand, okay, yeah, I think this is actually worth prioritizing, because if I don't do this, it's going to affect this customer, and that's bad, right? That's bad for the company. So I think even having common dashboards, speaking the same language, is something that could be very helpful to accelerate this trend. And I think data fabrics overall are one of those tools that can help with that, because you can now create common dashboards and look at the same data across different teams within an organization that are ultimately all responsible for security.
I can 100% confirm what you just described. I see it every day. I'm with you on that one. Your website is Leen, Leen.dev. And Kabir, how can people reach out to you if they want to learn more about Leen? Where's the best place to find you?
I'm very active on LinkedIn, so
Hmm.
that's a really good place to reach out. I love talking to folks in the industry, other founders, security practitioners. So yeah, if you listen to this and something that I've said is interesting, piqued your interest, please reach out. I'd be happy to chat more and learn about your security challenges and tell you more about Lean as well.
I'd love to talk to Neil, your CTO co-founder, at some point where we can roll around even more in the tech stack. I actually think you explained it well, so it's perfectly intuitive. Is there something that I should have asked about Lean that I did not ask?
No, I think you covered it. It was short and sweet. We got through a lot of content, I think, very quickly. Like I said, if folks are curious about anything that we've talked about today, there's it's a very deep topic. It's an emerging segment. There's a lot to discover. We obviously don't have all the answers as an early stage startup. There's a lot of discovery work that we're doing as well. We're always looking for partners to work with within enterprises and so on. So if any of these problems sound sort of relevant and you want to build internal tooling, please feel free to reach out and let's jam on it
Yeah,
together.
it's a great challenge. It's a big data challenge. It's an analytics challenge. I'm sure at some point you're going to put an AI layer on top of it as well. So there's plenty of interesting of work. Kabir, thank you. Kabir Mathur, CEO, co-founder of Leen, which provides a unified API for security data. Kabir, thank you so much, and we will talk soon.
Thanks a lot, Lars.
The Security Cloud podcast brought to you by Fix.